The hunter heard his dog barking furiously and went to an old tree. There, hanging upside down, was an exhausted woman who had been left to die. No one could believe what he did to her next. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The day began like so many others in the remote wilderness of Alaska, a place where the air itself seemed too sharp for ordinary men to breathe. Frost clung to the undergrowth, fragile lace shimmering in the pale morning light, and a thin crust of ice had already crept across the puddles left by last night's rain. The forest stretched endlessly, a kingdom of spruce and birch and shadow, where the cries of distant ravens echoed like fragments of forgotten prayers. For most, this wilderness was inhospitable, even hostile. But for Jonathan Crane, it was home. Jonathan had lived here long enough that the rhythms of the land were woven into his very bones. He was a man in his mid-40s, with the rough hands of someone who had built his own cabin, plank by plank, and the eyes of someone who had stared too long into silence. Years earlier, he had walked away from towns, from neighbors, from a life that had once carried promise. Out here, beyond the reach of paved roads and telephones, he had found a kind of uneasy peace. His only true companion was the dog that trotted faithfully at his side, a heavy-shouldered shepherd named Rex, whose bark could pierce the cold air like a rifle crack. This morning the forest felt especially still, as if the land itself held its breath in anticipation of winter. Jonathan adjusted the strap of his rifle across his back and watched Rex nose along the ground. The dog's tail flicked, his paws leaving crisp impressions in the frost. Jonathan's boots crunched against the moss, and his breath came out in thin clouds that quickly dissolved in the air. It was not unusual for him to spend days on end without seeing another human being. That was the way he liked it. He had built his cabin on the edge of an old logging road, long abandoned, where the trees had reclaimed what men once tried to take. There was a rhythm to his solitude. He rose before dawn, stoked the fire until the cabin glowed warm, then set out with rifle, pack, and dog. Some days the forest gave him meat or furs. Other days it gave him nothing but silence. But it was a silence he trusted. Unlike the chaos of his old life, unlike the noise of towns and the bitterness of memory, the forest's silence was clean. He trusted it the way a soldier trusts his weapon. That morning, however, the silence changed. It was a subtle shift, the kind that would pass unnoticed by anyone who had not lived for years with his ear tuned to the voice of the woods. The birds that usually flitted among the branches were gone. The rustle of squirrels in the undergrowth had ceased. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through the trees. Jonathan slowed his steps and frowned. Rex, usually steady, suddenly stiffened. The dog's ears shot forward, his tail rose rigid, and then, without warning, he let out a furious bark that shattered the stillness like breaking glass. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He knew his dog's voice as well as his own. This was no ordinary bark, no playful call when chasing a rabbit. This was alarm, sharp and insistent, carrying a note of danger that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. He raised his hand slightly, the old soldier's habit still buried in his movements, and Rex froze but continued to growl low in his throat. The dog's body pointed toward a stand of ancient spruce trees, their trunks black with age and their branches tangled into a canopy that swallowed light. For a moment Jonathan thought of Bear. The autumn was lean, and bears, desperate before hibernation, often prowled near cabins or streams. But this was not the scent of Bear. He could read the set of his dog's body, the agitation in the wag of his tail. Rex smelled something else. Jonathan adjusted the rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the walnut stock against his palm, and moved forward with careful steps. Each crunch of frost beneath his boots sounded louder than he wanted. As he neared the old spruces, the stillness deepened. The air felt heavier, colder. He paused, scanning the ground. Fresh disturbances showed themselves if one knew where to look. A patch of moss scraped away, a broken twig, a faint depression in the soil where someone had stepped. His frown deepened. He had not seen a stranger in weeks, and yet the forest told him someone had passed this way very recently. Rex barked again, frantic, and lunged forward. Jonathan followed quickly, his rifle now unslung, though still pointed down. His heart pounded faster with each step. The trees closed around him, shadows thickening. He could smell resin, damp bark, and something else, something acrid, out of place. Then he saw it. For a moment he thought his eyes deceived him. Up high among the thick branches of one of the tallest spruces, something pale swayed gently against the dark trunk. Jonathan blinked, stepping closer, his breath catching in his throat. And then, with a clarity that struck him like a blow, he understood what it was. A human form. A woman. She was bound cruelly, lashed to the tree by ropes that bit into her wrists and torso. Her head lolled forward, hair matted with dirt and pine needles, face streaked with grime. Her clothing was torn, her skin bruised, and her lips cracked as if she had been without water for far too long. She did not move save for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. Rex barked furiously at the base of the tree, leaping upward as though he could climb it himself. The sound rang through the forest, desperate, echoing like a plea. Jonathan's eyes swept the ground. He saw cigarette butts half crushed into the soil. He saw footprints, several pairs, heavy-soled boots pressed deep into the earth. And he saw, most disturbingly, the deliberate placement of the ropes, the way they had hoisted her up high, almost like a grotesque warning to anyone who might pass. His stomach twisted. This was no accident. Someone had done this deliberately, with intention. He felt the old instincts stir inside him, instincts he had buried when he left the world behind. The forest had given him peace, but peace was no longer possible. Someone had dragged cruelty into this place, into the quiet sanctuary he had built, and they had left their victim to die slowly, alone, in the branches of a tree. Jonathan tightened his grip on the rifle and exhaled slowly. The forest was silent again, but it was no longer the silence he trusted. It was a silence of watching eyes, of hidden threats. Somewhere, not far from here, the men who had done this might still be waiting. He knew he had to act quickly. He looked at the woman again, her body swaying gently against the trunk. Her face, gaunt and pale, was turned slightly toward him, and for an instant he thought he saw her eyelids flutter. His heart lurched. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Rex whined, pawing at the bark. Jonathan took a steadying breath. His day had begun as just another hunt, another step in the rhythm of survival. But now, in the silence of the forest, everything had changed, and he knew with absolute certainty that from this moment forward, there would be no return to the quiet life he had chosen. Jonathan's breath came hard in the cold air, misting before his eyes as he stood frozen at the base of the ancient spruce. The forest around him remained unnervingly still, as though the whole wilderness leaned in to watch what he would do. Rex barked and barked, circling the tree, the whites of his teeth flashing between the boughs, his claws raking into the soil as if he could dig his way up to the pale figure swaying above. Jonathan tilted his head back, squinting at the ropes that bit into the woman's body and arms. She was not some lifeless effigy. She was flesh and bone, still clinging to life, though he could see the faint tremors of breath stuttering through her chest. The sight ignited a pressure deep in his chest, something he had long tried to bury beneath years of isolation. He had come to these woods to forget the world of men and their cruelty, to let the silence replace the noise of memory. But here was cruelty made manifest, tied up against a spruce as if the forest itself had been turned into a gallows. He could not walk away. He would not. He moved closer, stepping carefully over the cigarette butts and trampled ground beneath the tree. The footprints were recent, pressed deep into the damp soil, the edges still sharp. At least 3 different pairs of boots, judging by the tread patterns. They had lingered here, perhaps even watched as she suffered. Jonathan's jaw clenched, and for a moment he scanned the shadows of the undergrowth, half expecting to see eyes peering back at him. But there was only Rex, barking himself hoarse, and the long hush of the trees. The woman's head lolled to one side, strands of dark hair plastered across her face with dirt and pine sap. Her clothing was torn, her flannel shirt ripped along the sleeves, jeans muddied and shredded at the knees. Her skin, what little he could see through the rips and grime, was raw with rope burns and bruises. She had been bound not just to restrain but to humiliate, lashed like some unwanted trophy. And whoever had left her here had done so with a kind of casual malice, confident no one would ever stumble across her. If not for Rex, Jonathan might have walked a different path this morning, and she would have died unheard, unseen. He stepped back a pace and judged the height. She had been tied at least 12 feet above the ground, where the lower branches forked. Whoever did this had needed rope, leverage, and time. This was no random act of violence. It was planned, deliberate. He thought again of the acrid smell he had noticed earlier. It lingered faintly even now, the stink of cheap cigarettes and maybe fuel. He knelt, pressing a hand to the soil where boot tracks overlapped. The depth of the impressions told him the men were large, heavy-set, used to carrying weight. Braconniers, perhaps, the kind who roamed the remote forests and left nothing but scarred stumps and empty snares behind. Jonathan felt Rex press against his leg, the dog's muscles taut as a bowstring. He reached down to steady him, fingers brushing the coarse fur between his ears. "Easy, boy," he murmured without thinking, though the sound of his own voice startled him after such long silence. The dog quieted but continued to stare upward, hackles still raised. Jonathan raised his eyes again. The woman's eyelids fluttered. It was the faintest motion, but it struck him harder than a shout. She was alive, fighting still, even though her body sagged like a rag doll. A low moan escaped her lips, almost swallowed by the forest air, but Jonathan heard it as clearly as a bell. His throat tightened. There was no choice anymore. He could not turn back and leave her strung there like carrion. The danger, whatever men had done this, would have to be faced later. For now, there was only the matter of getting her down. He slipped his pack from his shoulders and dropped it quietly against the roots of the spruce. His rifle he leaned carefully against the trunk within easy reach, though he doubted a bullet would protect him from what might already be watching. From the side pouch, he pulled free a coil of climbing rope and a long, narrow hunting knife. These had been tools for his own work, but tonight they would have to serve another purpose. He looped the rope around his waist, tied it in a knot honed by years of use, and tested its strength with a hard tug. His hands flexed around the knife, the blade catching what little light slipped through the branches. Rex whined low in his throat, pacing anxiously as Jonathan stepped to the base of the tree. He pressed a palm to the bark, rough with centuries of weather, then began to climb. Each movement was slow, deliberate. The tree's bark tore at his gloves, resin sticking to his fingers. His boots sought holds in the thick knots of the trunk, his arms straining as he pulled himself higher. He could feel the cold weight of the knife against his belt, the rope biting into his hips. Below him, Rex barked once, sharply as if urging him faster. The higher he climbed, the more the branches seemed to close around him, the world narrowing to the struggle of upward motion and the pale shape swaying above. At last he reached her. Up close, she seemed impossibly fragile, her wrists bound so tightly that the ropes had cut into her skin. Her breath came shallow, each exhale wheezing faintly against her chest. Her lips were cracked, the corners stained dark with dried blood. Jonathan felt a surge of anger that steadied his shaking hands. He wedged himself into the crook of the branches, balanced his weight, and pulled the knife free. "Hold on," he whispered, though he knew she might not hear. With a swift, practiced motion, he sliced through the rope around her wrists. The fibers split with a sharp twang, the tension jolting her body forward. He quickly shifted, sliding an arm around her to keep her from falling. The scent of her was raw and human, sweat and dirt and fear. He cut the second rope at her torso, and her weight slumped fully into him, heavier than he expected. She was thin, but limp bodies always weighed more than they seemed. Carefully, painstakingly, he began to descend. Every movement had to be precise, for one slip would send them both crashing to the ground. His muscles screamed with effort, but he gritted his teeth and focused only on the next foothold, the next grip of bark. Rex barked furiously below, circling as if to guide him down. The dog's cries echoed through the still forest, but Jonathan no longer cared who might hear. When at last his boots struck earth again, he nearly staggered with relief. He eased the woman down against the roots of the spruce, cradling her carefully as though she might shatter. Her head fell to one side, a faint groan escaping her lips. He crouched beside her, knife still in hand, scanning the woods for any movement. But the forest remained silent, heavy with the weight of what had been done here. He lowered the knife, pulled a canteen from his pack, and tipped a trickle of water against her lips. At first she did not respond. Then her throat convulsed weakly, swallowing. He gave her more, just a little, careful not to choke her. He broke a hard piece of dried bread from his satchel and tried to press a crumb between her teeth, but she was too weak to chew. He let it go. For now, water would have to be enough. As he worked, his mind kept circling back to the footprints, the cigarette butts, the deliberate cruelty of it all. Whoever had left her here could not be far, and if they returned, they would not be pleased to find their victim rescued. He felt the prickle of eyes on his back, though the shadows showed nothing. He had survived too many years by trusting such instincts. They were still out there, watching perhaps, waiting. Jonathan sat back on his heels, breathing heavily. He looked at the woman again. Her eyes flickered open for the briefest moment, glazed and unfocused, then slipped shut. But in that instant, he saw a spark of life still clinging, fragile but undeniable. The forest was no longer his sanctuary. It had become a stage for someone else's violence, and now he was entangled in it. Jonathan brushed a hand across Rex's fur, feeling the dog lean into him with steady strength. He had no illusions that this would be simple. He had no illusions that danger was not already upon them. But the choice had been made the moment Rex barked, and he looked up to see her swaying above the spruce. He gathered her gently into his arms, her weight awkward, her head lolling against his shoulder. Rex trotted at his side, still restless, ears flicking toward the trees. Jonathan adjusted his grip, stood, and glanced once more at the ropes dangling from the branches above. Whoever had tied them had meant for her to vanish here, for her body to be swallowed by the wilderness. Not this time, he thought. He turned away from the spruce, the woman secure against his chest, and began the slow walk back toward his cabin. The forest seemed to shift as he moved, shadows stretching longer, every sound amplified. Somewhere behind them a branch snapped, faint but deliberate. Jonathan froze, heart pounding, then pressed on, faster now, the weight of the woman reminding him of the urgency. He could not linger here another moment. The stillness had been broken. The silence he had once trusted was now an enemy. And though the path ahead promised nothing but peril, Jonathan knew there was no turning back. Jonathan carried the woman against his chest, his boots sinking into the frosted earth as he moved swiftly through the forest. Rex ranged just ahead, darting forward a few paces before circling back, his nose pressed to the ground, ears erect and twitching at every faint sound. The weight of the woman grew heavier with each step, not so much for her size as for the way her body hung limp, head rolling against his shoulder, limbs slack with exhaustion. He could feel the faintest warmth of her breath against his collar, the fragile rhythm that proved she was still alive, that more than anything kept him moving with grim determination through the thickening trees. The cabin was not close. He had built it far from the old logging road to ensure solitude, tucked deep where few ever ventured. On ordinary days he welcomed the long, lonely path. Today it felt like a gauntlet. Every shadow seemed to conceal movement. Every branch that cracked beneath his boot seemed to echo like a gunshot through the woods. He glanced back often, searching the forest for any sign of pursuit. Though he saw nothing, he could not shake the sense of being observed. The footprints and cigarette butts beneath that spruce had not been old. Whoever had done this to the woman could not be far. By the time he reached the ridge above the stream that wound toward his land, his arms burned from the strain of carrying her. He lowered her briefly to the ground, kneeling beside her to check her pulse. Her skin was clammy, but her heartbeat, though weak, still thudded against his fingertips. Rex whined, pacing impatiently, his body taut with warning. Jonathan lifted his head, listening. The forest whispered with the groan of branches, the faint creak of ice settling on the stream, but then fainter, distant. He caught it. The muffled crunch of boots on frozen soil, too deliberate to be deer, too heavy to be wolf. His stomach tightened. He slid the rifle from his shoulder and rested it across his knees, scanning the trees. The woman stirred weakly, her eyelids flickering, and a low moan broke from her throat. Jonathan set the rifle aside and leaned close, tipping a bit more water against her lips. She swallowed a few drops before coughing softly, her body trembling as if even the effort of breathing cost too much. He hushed her gently and gave her a moment before securing the rifle once more. He had no choice but to move. To linger was to invite those footsteps closer, to be caught with no cover and no plan. Gathering her again into his arms, he pressed on, heart hammering. Rex led the way now with urgency, tail stiff, pausing to bark sharply at the undergrowth before rushing ahead. The dog was not just a companion in this moment, but a lifeline. His instincts a warning Jonathan would not ignore. The cabin came into view at last, a squat structure of weathered timber half swallowed by the trees. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney. He had left it cold that morning. Its sight usually brought a sense of reassurance, the comfort of familiarity. Today it felt fragile, inadequate, a flimsy shell against the shadow of threat following him. He pushed through the clearing and up to the door, shouldering it open and stepping inside. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of pine and old wood smoke. He laid the woman carefully on the cot near the stone hearth and drew a thick blanket over her trembling body. Rex padded in after him, nails clicking against the floorboards, before planting himself at the door with a low growl deep in his throat. Jonathan ignored the sound for the moment and set about reviving the fire. He crouched before the hearth, stacking dry kindling, striking flint until sparks caught and flame licked upward. Soon the cabin filled with the soft crackle of burning wood and a fragile glow that cast the woman's face into relief. He studied her in the light, bruises along her cheek, rope burns that striped her wrists, lips cracked and swollen. She was young, though hardship had pressed its mark on her. She stirred again, lids fluttering, and this time her eyes opened enough to meet his. They were clouded, barely focused, but in them burned the faint awareness of survival. Her lips moved, shaping broken syllables he could scarcely hear. He leaned closer, his ear almost brushing her mouth. "They saw... can't... forest," she whispered, the words fractured and faint. Then her eyes rolled shut again, and she slipped once more into half-consciousness. Jonathan sat back heavily, pressing a hand across his jaw. Witness his mind supplied. She had seen something, perhaps something she was never meant to see, and they had left her to die for it. Rex growled louder now, the fur along his back bristling as he fixed his gaze on the dark window. Jonathan rose quickly, rifle in hand, and moved silently to the side of the frame. The moonlight caught faint glimmers outside, shadows shifting against shadows, movement just beyond the tree line. He held his breath, listening. There, the faint murmur of voices carried on the night air. 2, maybe 3 men, speaking low. He could not make out the words, but the tone was clear, sharp with suspicion. They were searching. Jonathan's muscles coiled tight. He turned back toward the cot, where the woman lay oblivious, her chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. He looked at Rex, whose gaze remained locked on the window, growl vibrating low and steady in his chest. The danger had followed them here. There would be no rest tonight. He doused the lantern so only the firelight flickered dimly across the room. He crouched near the cot, laying a hand briefly against the woman's shoulder to steady her trembling. "Hold on," he murmured softly, though he doubted she could hear. Then he moved to the door, rifle ready, heart steadying with the grim resolve of a man who had walked into danger too many times before. The forest pressed close outside, dark and waiting. The footsteps of strangers circled the cabin, fading and returning, voices whispering like the hiss of wind. Jonathan glanced once more at Rex, who stood poised like a coiled spring, ready to launch himself at the first sign of threat. Jonathan knew they were not safe here, not for long, but tonight he would keep her alive. He had no choice. The silence stretched again, heavy and watchful. The fire crackled softly. The woman breathed shallowly on the cot. Rex's growl rumbled steady as thunder in his chest. Jonathan stood at the door, rifle cold against his palms, and understood with stark clarity that the first real test of this unwanted path had already begun. And the men who had left her in the tree were not yet finished. The night dragged on, long and suffocating, as if the forest itself leaned its vast weight against the walls of Jonathan's cabin. Outside, the muffled crunch of boots had eventually faded into the trees, and the faint murmur of voices dissolved back into silence. But the silence was no longer the old familiar friend it had once been. Now it was edged with menace, stretched taut like a wire that might snap with the slightest pressure. Jonathan remained by the door long after the last sound died away, his rifle heavy in his hands, his eyes fixed on the window, where firelight reflected against black glass. Rex stood close, his body rigid, ears twitching at every faint whisper of the night. At last, when hours passed without intrusion, Jonathan allowed himself to retreat from the threshold. He crossed the small room to the cot near the fire, where the woman lay curled beneath the woolen blanket. The flames cast shifting shadows across her face, deepening the hollows of her cheeks and the bruises along her jaw. Her breathing came shallow and uneven, but she had not slipped further toward death. There was a stubborn rhythm to her chest, as though some fierce will within her refused to let go. Jonathan crouched beside her, studying the rope burns on her wrists and the crusted dirt that streaked her skin. His fingers hovered for a moment before he touched her pulse once more. Weak but steady. She was clinging on, and perhaps that meant there was hope. He fetched a pan of water from the bucket near the door, warmed it over the flames, and began gently cleaning the grime from her face. Each stroke of the damp cloth revealed not only her injuries, but her humanity-sunken features that spoke of hunger and exhaustion. A faint scar along her brow, lips cracked and trembling with the effort of unconscious breath. As he worked, Jonathan found himself speaking aloud, his voice low and rough from disuse. "You'll be all right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You've made it this far. That means something." Rex lay close to the cot, his head on his paws, watching with unblinking eyes as though standing guard over both of them. Hours crept by, measured by the slow collapse of logs into glowing embers. At times the woman stirred, lips moving in incoherent murmurs, fragments of words lost in fever. Jonathan leaned close each time, straining to catch them. Once he thought she whispered, "They know." Another time, "Forest," and "saw." Each fragment fed the unease already gnawing at his gut. She had been left for dead because she had seen something. That much was clear, and whatever she had seen was dangerous enough that men had dragged her into the wilderness to silence her. Toward dawn, she woke more fully. Her eyelids fluttered open, and her gaze, still clouded, fixed at last on Jonathan's face. He saw the faint spark of recognition that he was no longer the figure of torment, but a stranger who had pulled her back from the brink. Her voice was a rasp, broken and hoarse. "Where am I?" she whispered. "You're safe," Jonathan answered quietly, though even as he said it, he knew the word was fragile. "You're in my cabin. You were left tied up in the trees. I cut you down." Her eyes flickered, confusion and pain shadowing across them. She licked cracked lips, trying to speak again, and Jonathan reached for the canteen. He held it to her mouth, helping her drink in slow, careful sips. She swallowed greedily at first, then coughed, a painful rattle that shook her thin shoulders. When she had steadied, she sank back against the pillow, eyes closing briefly in exhaustion. "They'll come," she murmured finally, the words barely audible. "They'll come for me." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Who?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Her eyes opened again, glimmering in the dim light. "Men, hunters, not for deer, for timber, for whatever they can take. They saw me. I saw them." Her voice broke, and her body convulsed with a shudder as if the memory itself cut into her. Jonathan sat back, staring into the fire as the pieces began to assemble themselves. He had known of men like that, poachers, smugglers, loggers who came into protected lands with saws and rifles, leaving nothing but scars behind. Some were small-timers, reckless opportunists. Others were organized, dangerous, and ready to kill anyone who threatened their profit. If she had stumbled across them, if she had glimpsed something they could not afford to have known, then it made grim sense that they had bound her and left her to die. A body lost to the wilderness rarely raised questions. He studied her in silence. She was no accident, no stranger lost in the forest. She was a witness, and her survival was a threat to men who killed without hesitation. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Jonathan rose and added another log, though his thoughts remained heavy. He had come to this wilderness to escape precisely this kind of entanglement, to shed the weight of human cruelty. But now cruelty had arrived at his doorstep, unbidden, dragging with it a broken woman who clung to life on his cot. He could turn his back, wash his hands of her fate, but something deep in his chest recoiled at the thought. He had not ignored her cries when Rex found her, and he would not abandon her now. As the dawn lightened the edges of the window, Rex lifted his head and growled softly. Jonathan moved to the slit in the curtains, peering out into the pale wash of morning. The forest seemed calm again, blanketed in fog, yet the unease lingered. He had seen the signs last night. Men had followed him. They knew she was gone, and they would not stop until they found her. He turned back toward the cot. The woman had drifted again into a fragile sleep, her breathing still shallow but steadier than before. Her wrists, raw from the ropes, rested limply atop the blanket. Jonathan stood over her for a long moment, feeling the old pull of duty and the sharper edge of dread. The solitude he had carved for himself in these woods had ended the moment Rex barked at that spruce. The line of his life had shifted, perhaps irrevocably. The woman on the cot carried a secret, one that could bring violence crashing down upon them both. Jonathan lifted his rifle, checked the chamber, and set it within reach of the cot. The cabin smelled of smoke and damp wool, of pine and blood. Outside, the forest stretched vast and indifferent, but Jonathan knew now that indifference was a lie. Men had poisoned the silence, and the wilderness was no longer neutral. It had become a battleground. He sat by the fire, Rex at his feet, the woman's shallow breasts filling the space between them. Sleep would not come. He stared into the flames, listening for the first sign of footsteps in the snow. And as the night surrendered to dawn, Jonathan understood that his life of isolation had ended, and in its place stood a responsibility he had not sought but could not ignore. To guard the fragile secret of the woman who had survived the tree, and to face whatever hunted her through the woods. The pale dawn that seeped into the cabin did little to ease Jonathan's unease. The silence outside pressed against the wooden walls, deceptive in its stillness. Snow had fallen lightly in the night, softening the outlines of the trees and muting every sound. To any other eye, the world would have seemed peaceful, untouched. But Jonathan knew better. He had lived in these woods long enough to recognize the difference between natural quiet and the hush that followed the passing of men. There was weight in the air, as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting for the next move. The woman lay on his cot, her face damp with fever, lips parted in shallow breaths. She stirred occasionally, murmuring fragments of words that only deepened the mystery surrounding her. Sometimes she whispered numbers, sometimes names Jonathan did not recognize. Once she muttered a warning, "Don't follow the river," before falling silent again. He tended to her as best he could, feeding her weak broth when she woke, pressing cool cloths to her brow, all the while feeling the walls of his solitude closing in around him. By mid-morning, Rex became restless. The dog paced near the door, hackles raised, ears twitching at sounds Jonathan could not hear. When Jonathan opened the door, the crisp air rushed in, carrying the metallic bite of cold and the faint scent of wood smoke. His eyes narrowed. Wood smoke had no place here, not unless another cabin had sprouted overnight. The wind shifted, and he caught it again. Somewhere close by, men had built a fire. He crouched, pressing a hand to Rex's back. The dog quivered with alertness, eyes fixed on the line of pines. Jonathan scanned the snow at the edge of the clearing. At first, the white canvas appeared untouched, but then he saw it, a single boot print half hidden near the tree line. The edges were sharp, not yet softened by wind or melting. Whoever had made it had been there within hours, perhaps less. His gut tightened. They were circling. Jonathan returned inside, closing the door with deliberate care. The woman's eyes fluttered open as he set his rifle by the wall. "They're close," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure she heard him. Her gaze slid past him, clouded with fever, then closed again. He drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. For a moment he considered leaving, carrying her deeper into the wilderness, where no one could find them. But the snow was heavy, the terrain brutal. She would not survive such a journey in her condition. The cabin, crude as it was, offered the only shelter. That left one choice: defend it. The day dragged forward with tense slowness. Jonathan moved through the rooms of the cabin, checking every window, every gap in the walls. He blocked one window with a board, shifted the furniture to create cover near another, and placed his rifle where it would be within arm's reach no matter where he stood. Rex shadowed his every step, silent now, as if he too sensed that the time for barking had passed. By late afternoon, Jonathan's vigilance paid off. Through a crack in the shutter, he saw movement among the trees. Figures 3, maybe 4, slipping between the trunks, with the practiced stealth of men accustomed to hunting prey. They paused often, crouching to study the ground, then moved again. Jonathan's pulse quickened. They were tracking, searching for signs. They would find them soon enough. He pulled back from the window and steadied his breathing. Memories stirred unbidden of younger days when he had worn a uniform, when he had crouched in foreign woods with men at his side, listening for the same kind of approach. Back then he had thought he had left violence behind him when he retreated to this wilderness. Now it had found him again, and the stakes were not a war fought in distant lands, but the survival of one broken woman in his care. As the sun dipped low, casting the forest into a dim blue haze, Jonathan made his decision. He could not wait for them to come knocking at his door. That would end with the cabin in flames and the woman in their hands again. He had to meet them in the trees, where the land offered shadows and angles, where he had the advantage of knowing every hollow and ridge. He crouched beside the cot, speaking low. "I'll be close," he said, not knowing if she could truly hear. "You're safe here. Rex stays with you." The dog whined softly but obeyed when Jonathan gestured toward the woman's side. He pulled on his coat, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and stepped into the falling night. The forest swallowed him with its silence. Snow cushioned his boots, muffling each step as he slipped between trees, eyes scanning for movement. It wasn't long before he saw them again. 3 men this time, their outlines faint against the fading light. One carried a rifle, another an axe, the third a coil of rope slung across his shoulder. Jonathan watched them from the cover of a spruce, his breath steaming in the cold. They spoke in low voices, words indistinct but the tone unmistakable. They were confident, even careless, believing themselves the hunters. Jonathan's jaw clenched. They didn't know that the forest had turned against them, that every tree and shadow now belonged to him. He waited until they moved closer, then circled wide, using the land's natural curves to stay hidden. Each step was measured, calculated, like slipping back into an old skill he had never truly forgotten. The encounter came near dusk. The men paused at the edge of a clearing, and Jonathan made his move. A branch snapped deliberately beneath his boot, drawing their heads around. Before they could react, his voice rang out from the shadows. "That's far enough." The men stiffened, rifles half raised, eyes searching the dark. Jonathan stepped into the open, his own rifle leveled steady. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then the one with the axe spat into the snow. "She's ours," he said flatly. "Hand her over and walk away." Jonathan's grip tightened, though his voice remained calm. "She doesn't belong to you, and you won't get her." The standoff stretched taut, the air heavy with the promise of violence. Jonathan's heart hammered, but his hands were steady, his aim true. He had faced worse odds before. He could face them again. The men exchanged glances, their bravado flickering. They had expected a frightened hermit, not a man who stood firm with steel in his voice and a rifle aimed straight at their chests. At last, the leader cursed under his breath and motioned to the others. Slowly, grudgingly, they retreated into the trees, their eyes burning with promise. This was not the end. Jonathan remained still until the last trace of them vanished into the forest. Only then did he lower his rifle, breath escaping in a long, slow stream. The reprieve would be brief, he knew. They would be back, perhaps with more men, perhaps with fire and fury. But for now the cabin still stood, and the woman inside was safe. He turned back toward home, each step heavy with the knowledge that his life of isolation had been shattered beyond repair. He had chosen to intervene, to stand between her and those who hunted her, and in that choice lay the promise of blood yet to be shed. The shadows of the forest seemed to follow him as he walked, whispering of dangers yet unseen. When he reached the cabin, Rex greeted him with a sharp bark, tail stiff, eyes questioning. Jonathan knelt beside him, running a hand through the dog's fur. "We held them off," he murmured, "but it's not over." Inside, the woman slept, her face calmer now, as if some part of her had felt the battle fought on her behalf. Jonathan stood over her, watching the rise and fall of her chest, And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of responsibility not as a burden, but as a choice. He had stepped into the storm willingly, and he would see it through. The fire crackled, shadows shifting along the walls. Outside, the forest brooded, waiting. And Jonathan knew that the true fight had only just begun. The night after the standoff, with the three men dragged on like a punishment, heavy with silence that was no longer natural. Jonathan barely closed his eyes, sitting by the fire with his rifle across his knees, while Rex slept fitfully at his boots. Every creak of the wooden beams, every sigh of the wind against the shutters felt like a warning. He had turned them away this time, but he knew the kind of men he was dealing with. They would not accept defeat so easily. The woman on his cot was proof of their ruthlessness. She had been left to die not out of mercy, but because they believed the forest itself would finish what they had begun. Jonathan had cut her down and brought her back, and by doing so had signed his name to a battle that now belonged to him, whether he wished it or not. By dawn, he could no longer sit still. He checked the perimeter of the clearing, every boot sinking deep into the crusted snow, his eyes catching each bent branch and mark in the drifts. Tracks were there, faint but recent. The men had circled in the night, drawing close enough to watch the cabin, then retreating. He crouched low, brushing his fingers across one print, his jaw tightening. They were testing him, gauging his vigilance, deciding how best to return. When he stepped back into the cabin, the woman was awake. Her eyes followed him as he set his rifle against the wall, and though her voice was weak, it carried more strength than the night before. "You faced them," she said, not as a question, but as a truth she had somehow sensed. Jonathan met her gaze, seeing in it a flicker of the steel that had allowed her to survive what they had done to her. "I sent them away," he answered simply. Her lips curved in something too thin to be called a smile. "They'll come back stronger." "I know," Jonathan said. He pulled the chair closer to the cot and sat, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow in the firelight. "That's why you need to tell me what you saw. Who are they? Why were you their target?" She swallowed, her throat still raw, but after a pause she began. Her name was Elena Marlowe. She had been hiking near the river when she heard the sound of chainsaws deep in a stretch of forest where no cutting was allowed. Curiosity had drawn her closer. What she saw was more than poachers. It was an operation. Men with trucks, cutting and hauling timber in enormous quantities. But worse, she had noticed crates being unloaded, boxes stenciled with markings that had nothing to do with logging. She had seen rifles, ammunition, and something that looked like chemicals stored in sealed drums. They were using the forest as a cover, a place where no ranger or outsider was meant to stumble. When she had been spotted, they had dragged her off, bound her, and decided she was better off erased. As her words spilled out in broken fragments, Jonathan felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. These were not simply reckless trespassers. This was organized, dangerous, and connected to something much larger than smuggling timber. And now he was tangled in it by the simplest of choices, refusing to walk past a cry for help. He stood and moved to the window, his mind working. "Then we don't have much time," he said half to himself. "If they fear exposure, they'll try to silence us quickly." The day passed under a sky that seemed to darken too fast. Jonathan fortified the cabin, laying extra wood against the walls, checking every nail and hinge, and preparing what he could for the night he knew was coming. He fed Elena what little food she could manage and set Rex to guard the door, the dog's ears twitching constantly at distant sounds. As twilight bled into night, Jonathan felt the weight of inevitability press upon him. It began with smoke. Rex growled low before Jonathan smelled it, faint at first, then stronger, curling beneath the doorframe. Jonathan's heart lurched as he rushed to the window. Out beyond the clearing, orange light flickered between the trees. Fire. They had set fire to the woods, using it as both weapon and distraction. The smoke rose thick and fast, carried by the wind toward the cabin. The men meant to burn him out, to force him into the open. Jonathan grabbed the bucket, filling it with snow to melt, but he knew water would be useless if the fire spread wide enough. He turned to Elena. She tried to sit up, fear and fury mingling in her face. "They'll kill us," she rasped. "Not if I stop them first," he said, his voice steady. He took up his rifle, checked the chamber, and looked at Rex. "Guard her," he ordered. The dog bristled but understood, planting himself firmly by the cot. Jonathan pushed out into the night, the blast of cold air meeting the thick bite of smoke. The flames were spreading along a line of brush, ignited deliberately, driving toward the cabin like a hungry beast. Figures moved behind the fire, their outlines dancing in the glow. Jonathan raised his rifle and fired once, the crack cutting across the roar of flames. A shout rang out, followed by scrambling. He fired again, not to kill but to scatter them, to remind them they were not unopposed. The fire licked higher, sparks flying into the branches above. Jonathan cursed under his breath and sprinted along the edge of the flames, using his heavy coat to beat down patches where he could. Sweat poured despite the cold, smoke searing his throat, but he fought with the desperation of a man who knew that surrender meant death. His muscles screamed, his ribs ached, but still he battled the blaze. From the shadows beyond the fire, bullets cracked, whistling through the night. Jonathan dove behind a log, heart hammering, ears ringing with the closeness of the shots. He returned fire, his bullets striking sparks from stone and bark. The men cursed, shouting in anger, their confidence slipping as they realized the hermit was more soldier than recluse. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The fire consumed what it could, but Jonathan's furious resistance slowed its spread. The snow helped, dampening what the flames tried to claim, and at last the wind shifted, pushing the smoke away from the cabin. Jonathan staggered back into the clearing, lungs burning, face streaked with ash. He had held the line. The cabin still stood, but the men were not finished. As he bent to catch his breath, a figure lunged from the trees, knife flashing in the firelight. Jonathan barely had time to swing the butt of his rifle, cracking it across the man's jaw. The attacker crumpled into the snow, groaning. Another emerged, but Rex was there, teeth bared, launching with a snarl that sent the man tumbling backward in panic. The dog's fury drove him into retreat, his curses fading into the night. At last, the forest fell silent again, broken only by the crackle of dying flames and the wheeze of Jonathan's breath. He stood tall, rifle raised, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing came. They had been repelled, at least for now. When he returned inside, Elena's eyes widened at the sight of him, blackened with soot, coat scorched, but still standing. Rex padded in behind him, fur bristling, muzzle streaked with the blood of his foe. Jonathan set the rifle aside and leaned heavily against the wall. Elena whispered, voice trembling, "You fought them back." "For tonight," Jonathan said. He looked to the fire, watching the sparks drift upward. "But they'll return. They won't stop until one of us is gone." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Jonathan knew the truth of them. The fire had been their test, a probe to measure his resolve. And in beating it back, he had proven not only his strength, but his commitment. Now they would come harder, with more men and more fury. He sat by the cot, exhaustion pulling at every bone. Elena reached weakly for his hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed his calloused skin. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. Jonathan looked into her fevered eyes, seeing not just fear, but the fragile spark of survival that had carried her through torment. He had no easy answer. Perhaps because he could not stand aside when cruelty was done. Perhaps because once, long ago, he had wished someone had fought as fiercely for him. Outside, the forest smoldered, scarred by fire but still standing. Inside, the cabin glowed with the fragile light of survival. Jonathan tightened his grip on her hand, his voice low but certain. "Because if I don't, no one will." And as the last embers of the night faded into darkness, he knew the true battle had only begun, and the cost would be more than fire and smoke. It would be blood. The forest was not the same after the fire. Jonathan could feel it in the brittle silence that followed, in the charred smell that clung to the clearing, even as snow fell to smother the last traces of flame. The cabin had survived, but only barely. Its walls bore black streaks where sparks had caught. The ground outside was pocked with ash and frozen clumps of scorched earth, and the air was heavy with the memory of smoke. Yet Jonathan knew the greater danger had not passed. The men had retreated, but retreat was never surrender. They would return, and when they did, they would come not as shadows testing him in the dark, but as hunters determined to end it. He sat through the night with his rifle cradled in his arms, the fire burning low. Rex at his feet. The woman, Elena, slept uneasily, her lips moving with dreams Jonathan could not hear. At times she whimpered. At others she stirred so violently he feared she would tear her wounds open again. But she always stilled when he placed a hand on her shoulder and spoke softly. She trusted him now, though neither of them had chosen this bond. It had been forged in survival, and survival had no time for choice. By dawn, Jonathan's mind was clear. They could not remain here. He had held the line once, even twice, but the next time the men came, they would not rely on fire or small numbers. They would bring guns, numbers, and perhaps worse. The cabin would be reduced to rubble, and he would be cut down before he could protect her. That was not an end he could accept. There was only one path left to move her, to risk the wilderness and try to reach the ranger station 2 valleys over. It would take days in the snow, and she was weak, but it was the only hope of reaching help, of exposing what she had seen, of ending the threat. He told her this as the pale light seeped into the cabin. Her eyes were tired but clear when she listened, her voice weak but steady. If we go, they'll follow. They'll follow, Jonathan agreed. But out there, I know the land better than they do. Here they can surround us. Out there, I can choose the ground. She studied him with an expression that was part fear, part faith. And if we don't make it, Jonathan met her gaze without flinching. Then at least we try. By mid-morning, he had fashioned a crude sled from planks of wood and rope, padded with furs to soften the jarring ride for her frail body. Rex paced anxiously as Jonathan secured Elena to it, her thin figure wrapped tightly in blankets. She protested at first, ashamed of her weakness, but Jonathan silenced her with a look. Save your strength, he said. We'll need it. The forest was heavy with fresh snow, muffling their passage as Jonathan hauled the sled along narrow trails. Rex trotted ahead, nose low, ears flicking at every sound. The silence was eerie, broken only by the hiss of sled runners and the steady crunch of Jonathan's boots. For hours they moved, weaving through thickets, crossing frozen streams, always angling northward toward the ridge that marked the path to the ranger station. But the men were never far. By afternoon, Rex's growl alerted Jonathan to their approach. Voices carried faintly through the trees, rough laughter that made Jonathan's grip tighten on the rope. They were tracking, closing in. Jonathan pulled Elena's sled into a hollow beneath a cluster of fallen logs, camouflaging it with snow and branches. He crouched beside her, rifle in hand. Stay here, don't move, no matter what you hear. Her hand caught his wrist, trembling but insistent. Don't let them take me. They won't, Jonathan said, the promise burning like iron in his chest. He rose and melted into the trees, rifle ready, every muscle alive with memory. The clash came swiftly. 3 men pushed through the undergrowth, rifles slung, their eyes sharp with anticipation. Jonathan struck first, a warning shot splitting the air and sending them scattering for cover. Bullets ripped bark from trees, snow exploded around him, but Jonathan moved like a man who had fought too many times before. He fired, ducked, shifted position, the forest itself his ally. One man cried out, clutching his shoulder, and the others hesitated. That hesitation was all Jonathan needed. He drove them back, forcing them to retreat deeper into the trees, leaving a trail of curses and blood behind. When he returned to Elena, she was pale but alive, her eyes wide with fear. You're bleeding, she whispered, seeing the red line along his arm where a bullet had grazed him. It's nothing, he said, binding it quickly with a strip of cloth. We move. They pressed on through the long night. Jonathan's strength strained to its limits as he hauled the sled up the ridge. The cold bit deep. The wind cut cruelly, but he would not stop. Every step was a defiance, every breath a vow that he would see her safe. By dawn they reached the high ground, the valley stretching wide below. The ranger station was still days away, but it was closer than it had been. Hope flickered like the faint light on the horizon. But the men were not done. On the second day, as they crossed a frozen river, they came. More this time, 6 at least, fanning out along the banks, rifles glinting in the pale sun. Jonathan felt the trap snap shut. He pushed the sled behind a snowbank, thrusting the rifle into his hands and faced them. Rex stood bristling at his side, teeth bared, a growl like thunder in his chest. The battle was brutal and swift. Gunfire cracked, echoing across the ice. Men shouting, bullets whining. Jonathan fought with the grim certainty of a man who knew this was the endgame. He moved, fired, ducked, each shot measured, each breath controlled. Rex launched himself at one man, dragging him down with savage fury. Elena, too weak to fight, screamed his name, and the sound drove him harder. He dropped one, then another, until the survivors faltered, retreating with fear where once they had carried only cruelty. The silence afterward was absolute, broken only by the ragged rasp of Jonathan's breath. He stood in the snow, rifle smoking, Rex at his side. The bodies of the fallen sprawled across the ice. Elena stared at him from the sled, her face pale with horror and awe. He lowered the rifle slowly, chest heaving. The choice lay before him now. He could chase the survivors, finish it, or he could take Elena and press on, carrying her toward the fragile promise of safety. His eyes met hers, and in them he saw not just fear, but a plea for life, for deliverance. He chose her. Gathering the rope, he pulled the sled forward, Rex limping but unbroken beside him. The snow swallowed their tracks as the wind rose, erasing the scars of battle. Behind them lay blood and death, ahead the thin hope of justice. Jonathan did not know if they would reach the ranger station, or if the men would regroup and strike again. But he knew one truth with absolute certainty: he would not abandon her. He would fight until his last breath to see her safe. And as the forest closed around them once more, the silence returned. Not the silence of menace, but the old sacred silence of the wilderness, bearing witness to a man who had chosen not solitude but duty, not escape but defiance, and not peace but the hard, necessary work of protecting another soul. Don't stop here. The next story will shock you even more, and you won't believe what we've already uncovered in our other videos. Hit that subscribe button right now, turn on the bell so you never miss what's coming, and share this video with a friend. Let's see how many people we can leave speechless tonight.